There was a time when the galaxy believed itself eternal, a time when light from 1,000,000 suns poured into one world, Trantor, the capital of all human civilization. Its metal surface shimmered like liquid mercury beneath an artificial sky, a planet turned into a single endless city, every square meter engineered, every life catalogued, every breath owned. But even empires that conquer the stars fear one thing: knowledge, because knowledge remembers what power forgets, that nothing lasts forever. Imagine standing beneath Trantor's domed heavens. Air scrubbers hum like sleeping giants. Conveyor belts carry officials through corridors that stretch for kilometers. You'd hear the quiet rhythm of bureaucratic eternity, a machine that believes itself divine. And yet, hidden in the noise, something is beginning to break. Statisticians whisper of inefficiencies too vast to correct. Scribes rewrite records to hide shortages on the outer worlds. The Imperial Library deletes inconvenient data. The Empire is decaying, not with violence, but with paperwork. That's when a mathematician steps forward and says, "I can prove the Empire will fall." His name is Hari Seldon. At first, they laugh. Then they listen. Then they panic, because Seldon's theory isn't just about history, it's about the future. He claims he can predict it. Not perfectly, not for individuals, but for civilizations. Given enough data, he says, human behavior can be modeled like weather, storms of faith, droughts of knowledge, floods of war. He calls his science psychohistory. And in the heart of the most powerful empire ever built, that idea is treason. It begins with a paradox. If you can predict the future, do you still have a choice? If every revolution, every collapse, every betrayal is just another point on a curve, then what becomes of free will? This question is what makes psychohistory dangerous. Not because it's false, but because it might be true. Empires survive on illusion, the illusion that their rule is permanent, that their authority is ordained, that their collapse is unthinkable. But if one man can prove that history follows mathematical law, then even emperors are no more special than atoms in motion. So the empire does what empires always do. It tries to bury the idea. Seldon is summoned to the imperial palace, a cathedral of marble and light where silence itself feels regulated. He's questioned by the Commission of Public Safety. They ask him if he believes the empire can be saved. He answers, no, but it can be reborn. That single sentence seals his fate. The men who question him don't understand the math, but they understand power. And they see a man who holds the future in numbers, something no throne can tolerate. So they accuse him of spreading panic, of undermining imperial morale. They offer him a choice: recant or face exile to the farthest edge of the galaxy. He chooses exile. But what the Empire doesn't realize is that exile is exactly what he wanted. The camera widens, the scale shifts from one man to one civilization. We see Trantor from orbit, a planet that looks like a jewel of light wrapped in smog and arrogance. Beneath its brilliance lies rot. Underground heat sinks overloaded. Food imports collapsing. Riots suppressed before they can spread. The Imperial News Network never reports these things, but psychohistory sees them all and folds them neatly into its equations. Hari Seldon's vision is not mystical, it's statistical. He doesn't claim to read minds or see the future in visions. He just believes that in large enough numbers, humanity is predictable. A single person is chaos, a crowd is mathematics, and the empire has quadrillions. But how do you explain to a government that their fate is already written? How do you tell a god that it will die? You don't. You let history do it for you. He gathers a small group, scientists, historians, mathematicians, and they begin work on something they call the Encyclopedia Galactica. Officially, it's a project to record all human knowledge. Unofficially, it's the seed of civilization's rebirth after the empire falls, because Seldon has seen the future. He knows that when this vast empire collapses, and it will, the galaxy will plunge into 30,000 years of chaos, war, and barbarism, but with the right preparation, that dark age can be shortened to just 1,000 years. That's the Seldon plan. 1,000 years of rebuilding instead of 30,000 of ruin. A millennium of order instead of an age of ashes. A future designed, not left to chance. And all of it hidden in plain sight, disguised as a scholarly project while the Empire sleeps. Cut to Trantor's night side. The lights dim to simulate dusk, but the city never truly sleeps. Senators still argue over budget allocations. Technicians still tend to reactors beneath the crust. On a balcony high above the metal surface, Seldon stands alone, watching artificial stars glimmer against the dome. He whispers to his assistant, "Do you hear it?" "Hear what? The sound of the future?" "It's already beginning." The assistant listens, hears only the hum of engines, the distant murmur of the city. But Seldon hears something else, the pattern beneath the noise, the rhythm of inevitability, the heartbeat of history itself. And then, somewhere deep below the surface, a light flickers, a sensor failure in a food depot, a statistic too small for any official to notice. But psychohistory notices, because that small failure will ripple outward, shortages, unrest, reform, rebellion, all leading, step by step, toward collapse. This is not prophecy, it's mathematics. Pause. Look around our own world for a moment. We too live inside an empire, one built not of metal but of data. Our cities run on algorithms, our markets move faster than human thought. We are watched, measured, predicted, our behavior modeled by systems we don't understand. Sound familiar? Seldon's psychohistory may not exist yet, but its shadow already does. Social networks, intelligence agencies, corporations, all trying to predict the next movement of the human storm. Maybe we're closer to the empire than we'd like to believe. Maybe psychohistory was never fiction. Maybe it was a warning. The day Hari Seldon is sentenced, he doesn't resist. He simply nods, as if confirming a line in his equations. The guards escort him through corridors lined with golden walls that reflect his face again and again, thousands of Seldons fading into infinity. At the shuttle port, he turns once, looks back toward Trantor's skyline, and smiles. He knows what no one else does. The future isn't being erased. It's being rewritten. The shuttle door closes, the engines ignite. The capital fades into the distance, swallowed by its own light, and somewhere, in the heart of the empire, a bureaucrat files the record away under case closed. But history never closes. It only waits. Because what left Trantor that day wasn't just a man. It was an idea too dangerous to kill, too precise to ignore, too human to contain. The forbidden science had begun, and so the question remains. If one man could predict the fall of an empire, could he also predict what comes after, or is even the future afraid of itself? For 12,000 years, the Galactic Empire stretched across the stars. From the outer dust worlds to the silver palaces of the core, its banners gleamed on 1,000,000 suns, and at its center, like a jewel too bright to look at directly, lay Trantor, the capital of all human civilization. A single planet, entirely covered in metal, every continent sealed beneath domes of steel, every ocean drained, paved, repurposed into cooling seas for engines buried miles deep. From orbit, it shone like a bronze mirror reflecting eternity itself. They said it would never fall. They always say that. History remembers Trantor as a symbol of order, progress, inevitability. But if you listen closely, history also whispers something darker, that everything which grows too perfect begins to rot beneath its own weight, that even a galaxy cannot escape the laws of entropy. Hari Seldon understood this. Long before anyone else, he saw what no one wanted to see. The equations were clear. The decline had already begun. But how do you tell a civilization that it's dying when it still believes it's immortal? Trantor's towers stretched 1/2 mile into the sky, but beneath them ran tunnels older than the empire itself. Power flowed endlessly through conduits the size of rivers. Every second, 10,000 freighters arrived from the edges of the galaxy, bringing food, minerals, luxuries, everything a world without soil required to live. It was a machine that consumed the stars to sustain itself, and as with every machine, it had one fatal flaw: dependence. The outer worlds fed Trantor. The outer worlds mined, built, and bled for it. When those links weakened, through rebellion, famine, or simple neglect, the machine began to falter, and yet inside its walls, no one could imagine collapse. Bureaucrats shuffled data across endless corridors, believing that the Empire's perfection was guaranteed by the sheer volume of its paperwork. The Ministry of Agriculture alone employed 3 million analysts. The Department of Provincial Taxation filled an entire city.
There were clerks whose sole duty was to verify the verification of other clerks. To most citizens, the Empire was not something to question. It was simply the air they breathed. But time moves in cycles. Rome, Byzantium, Britain, each believed itself eternal. Each fell, not from invasion, but from exhaustion. Empires die not when enemies strike from without, but when the will to reform vanishes within. And so, even as the stars themselves bowed to Trantor's command, the slow rot of bureaucracy spread like rust across the galaxy. Hari Seldon once described it in a single phrase: an empire that has forgotten how to learn. By the time he arrived on Trantor, a small man from Helicon carrying a handful of equations, the empire had already begun its long descent. But no one knew it. The mathematicians of the University of Streeling thought his work abstract. The emperor's advisors called it dangerous. After all, what ruler welcomes a prediction of his own downfall? Still, Seldon persisted. Psychohistory was not prophecy. It was science, a mathematical framework capable of predicting the behavior of masses, not individuals, but civilizations. It revealed patterns in chaos. It turned the tide of human history into something measurable, and therefore something preventable, at least in theory. But the deeper he went, the more terrifying the results became. His models showed a collapse so vast that no single world would escape. 30,000 years of darkness, ignorance, and barbarism before civilization could rise again. And no power, not even an emperor, could stop it. The fall was inevitable. The only question was how long the darkness would last. When Seldon presented his findings to the Imperial Council, silence filled the chamber. The men who ruled 1,000,000 worlds stared at him as if he'd spoken blasphemy. "The Empire," one of them said, "has endured 12 millennia. You think your numbers can erase that?" But numbers do not lie. Only men do. He was branded a traitor, his science labeled heresy. The great machine of Trantor had no room for truth, only for maintenance of illusion. And so, they tried to bury him. Yet beneath the city's endless metal layers, in the forgotten vaults of the university, Seldon began to gather followers. Scientists, historians, and idealists, the ones who still believed knowledge could outlast empire. Together, they built something new, the Foundation. It began as an encyclopedia project, a harmless front for the most dangerous idea in history. Behind its shelves of data, behind its polite rhetoric of preservation, lay the seed of a second civilization, one that would rise from the ashes when the empire fell. That was the genius of psychohistory. It did not save individuals, it saved patterns. Seldon's plan was audacious: let the empire die, but make sure humanity remembers enough to rebuild. Not in 30,000 years, but in 1,000. A single millennium of darkness instead of 30. A plan written not in ink, but in probability. But there was a flaw. Psychohistory could not account for chance, for anomalies, for emotion. It predicted the movement of trillions, but not the whim of one man. That was the danger. That was the risk. And somewhere deep within the equations, Seldon knew the truth. One unpredictable variable could undo it all. In his secret writings, he called it the shadow factor, the unpredictable force that mathematics could never tame. He feared it even as he prepared for it.
As he worked, Trantor continued to shine, but its light was hollow. The outer provinces rebelled. Trade slowed. Riots flared in the underworlds beneath the city. Reports were ignored, buried in endless bureaucratic chains. The aristocracy continued their feasts above, their palaces glowing beneath the domes. They did not feel the ground trembling beneath them. And so, the empire lived on, confident, complacent, doomed. There is a strange kind of beauty in watching a civilization die, not in its suffering, but in its symmetry. The same pride, the same blindness, the same decay. Across millennia and galaxies, every empire thinks it is the exception. Every empire believes the laws of history have been rewritten in its favor. But history does not negotiate. It only waits. The fall of Trantor would not come tomorrow nor next century. But it had already begun. And beneath the metal skin of that world, in the heart of the greatest empire ever built, one man's forbidden science had already lit a fuse that would one day ignite the galaxy. Because nothing lasts forever. Imagine walking the surface of Trantor at dawn. There is no sky, only steel. The first light of a distant sun filters through the translucent domes that cover the capital. It bends and scatters, caught on towers and transmission spires, bathing the city in a copper glow. From above, it looks like a sea of machinery waking from sleep. From within, it feels alive, like standing inside the body of a god. The sound is constant. The hum of grav lifts, the whisper of ventilation shafts, the roar of billions moving through corridors that stretch for kilometers. Vendors cry out in a dozen dialects. Bureaucrats rush past, clutching data tablets and reports bound for offices so deep within the planet that sunlight hasn't touched them in centuries. The scent of ozone mixes with the faint sweetness of synthetic food, the oil from machinery, and the smoke from reactor vents that rise like incense to forgotten gods. Trantor is not just a city. It is the empire made flesh. Each building is a memory, each light a pulse. Hari Seldon often said that to understand psychohistory, you had to stand on Trantor's surface and feel it, the weight of billions acting as one organism. Psychohistory did not measure people, it measured pressure. It measured collective moods, mass reactions, and inevitable patterns that emerged when civilizations reached a certain scale. To a casual observer, the city looked eternal. But Seldon's eyes saw something else, turbulence beneath the surface, the subtle shifts in behavior, the slow withdrawal of trust in authority, the rising strain on supply lines that no bureaucratic chart could conceal. It was like reading a dying star's spectrum, still bright to the eye, but already decaying at its core. And perhaps the most terrifying part was how familiar it felt. Because even now, in our own time, you can stand in cities that echo Trantor's pulse. Manhattan at night, Beijing from the sky. The networks hum, the data flows, the infrastructure holds. For now, every modern metropolis is a smaller Trantor, dependent, intricate, fragile. We mistake complexity for stability. We believe our systems too vast to fail, but the lesson of psychohistory is cruel in its simplicity. Scale does not prevent collapse. It accelerates it. Hari Seldon once compared civilizations to thermodynamic systems. Entropy, he said, is not destruction. It is inevitability. In every human empire, from Sumer to Rome to Trantor, order breeds inefficiency, efficiency breeds arrogance, and arrogance breeds decay. The greater the order, the more catastrophic the collapse. He was not a prophet, but his equations bordered on heresy. They implied that no empire, no ideology, no civilization could escape the cycle. Only the timing differed, and so, the empire's greatest triumph, Trantor itself, was also its greatest flaw. It had centralized everything: governance, trade, defense, and even knowledge. If Trantor fell, the galaxy would follow. Seldon's students debated whether decentralization could save the empire. Could the outer worlds become autonomous enough to survive when the core failed? But the answer? Hidden deep within the equations was no. The structure was already too rigid. The collapse was not a possibility, it was a law. Still, he refused to surrender to despair. If decay was inevitable, perhaps the pattern could be guided, shaped, even shortened. That was the seed of psychohistory's defiance, not to defy fate, but to tame it. To outsiders, it sounded mystical, but to Seldon, it was the ultimate expression of reason. If chaos had rules, those rules could be used to save humanity. The Foundation would be that instrument, a tiny island of logic in a future sea of ignorance. But the Empire could not allow such heresy to stand. On Trantor, power rested not in thrones but in committees, ministries, and archives that had forgotten their purpose centuries ago. The bureaucracy was a self-perpetuating organism. Ministers feared nothing more than change. It meant exposure, accountability, instability. So when Seldon's theories began to attract attention, the reaction was swift. First came surveillance, then inquiries, then the accusation of dangerous speculation. But the real danger wasn't Seldon's equations. It was what they revealed about the people in power, that they were merely caretakers of a corpse pretending to breathe. Trantor's Senate chambers were colossal, marble, gold, and light suspended beneath a dome larger than any cathedral. It was built to inspire awe. Yet Seldon noticed the cracks, literal and metaphorical. The air recyclers stuttered. The holographic displays flickered. The senators argued over funding for agricultural imports from planets that no longer existed. It was theater, the Empire governed by inertia. And if you listen carefully, you can still hear echoes of that same theater in our own world. Politicians debating symptoms, ignoring causes, economies expanding on borrowed time, the illusion of permanence sustained by data, markets, and faith. What psychohistory predicted for Trantor is not science fiction. It is a mirror. Every generation believes itself more enlightened than the last. Every empire thinks its moral clarity or technological prowess will spare it from history's judgment. Yet every curve on Seldon's chart ended the same way, in silence. The silence after the machines stop. After the archives burn, after the light goes out and all that remains is memory. Seldon once asked a question his students could not answer. If you knew the exact date of your civilization's death, would you change anything? The silence that followed was not from ignorance, but fear, because deep down they already knew the answer. It's the same silence that fills the halls of every modern empire, the quiet acknowledgement that comfort always precedes collapse. And so in his final notes before his arrest, Seldon wrote something that has outlived the empire itself. We can't stop the end, but we can build what comes after. The words became a kind of secret prayer, a warning whispered by those who understood the weight of inevitability. And as the empire slept, he continued to build the foundation beneath its feet, the blueprint of rebirth buried beneath layers of indifference and denial. The capital still glittered, the lights still burned, but the city's pulse had changed. The hum that once symbolized power now carried a faint tremor, the first signal of instability in the great machine of humanity. Seldon saw it clearly, as if the numbers themselves whispered. The fall had begun. At street level, Trantor didn't feel like the center of a galaxy. It felt like a labyrinth that had forgotten its architect. The tunnels stretched in every direction, alive with light and motion. Vendors sold steaming synth meat and cups of amber broth that glowed faintly under the ultraviolet lamps. Children chased drones through alleys lined with recycling chutes. The air was heavy, damp, and laced with iron. Most of the city's citizens had never seen the stars. They were born under steel, lived under steel, and would die beneath the same metal ceiling. The Empire called this progress, to conquer nature by erasing it. One of them was a young records clerk named Alar. His job was to file shipment manifests for agricultural imports from 500 worlds. He worked in the Ministry of Resource Balance, a department so vast that its corridors looped in on themselves like a living maze. Every day, Alar walked past the same mural of the imperial seal, its once gilded edges now dull. Every day, he watched the data flicker on his console as planets began missing deliveries, or as grain exports from Anacreon were quietly reassigned to unaccounted storage. He didn't question it. No one did. Questioning meant attention, and attention meant risk. But one evening, as he was about to leave, he noticed something strange in the reports. Entire sectors missing, not just from the manifests but from the system memory itself. Dozens of worlds simply erased. When he asked his superior, the man only smiled faintly. "There are no errors," he said, "only adjustments." That night, Alar dreamed of stars, something he had never seen in person. In his dream, they flickered like dying embers. Elsewhere, on a higher level of the capital, the Senate prepared for another session. Servants polished the marble floors. Technicians adjusted the acoustic filters to make every speech sound noble, even when the words meant nothing. The senators would arrive in shining robes, their faces projected across the chamber by golden drones. Among them sat Senator Loran, an old man whose family had ruled 3 sectors for centuries. His voice trembled when he spoke now, not from age but from doubt. He had begun to notice how the senators argued for hours about trade routes while ignoring the food riots erupting in the lower strata. He had seen the petitions from the outer worlds begging for relief stamped pending review until they vanished from record. Loran once believed in the Empire, the idea that order was worth sacrifice. But lately, he found himself wondering if order had become the sacrifice itself. The session began with the Grand Minister's voice booming through the hall. "Citizens of Trantor, let it be known that the Empire stands eternal." The senators applauded, cameras flashed, and beneath their feet, in the forgotten chambers of the planet, a quiet meeting took place. A handful of mathematicians and exiled scholars listening to a frail old man explain a theory that could predict the Empire's death. Hari Seldon sat at the center of the small, dim room. The light above him flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. Around him, his students, Gall Dornick among them, watched in reverent silence. "Understand this," Seldon said softly. "We cannot stop what comes. We can only choose how humanity survives it." Gall frowned. "But if your equations are correct, the fall is inevitable." "What hope is there?" Seldon looked at him, eyes tired but certain. "Hope lies in knowledge, preserved, hidden, waiting. 1,000 years of darkness is better than 30,000. His words carried a quiet gravity. No prophecy, no promise, only fact.
Suddenly, the door slid open. Imperial guards filled the entryway, armor gleaming, faces unreadable. The silence broke like glass. "Professor Hari Seldon," the officer said, "you are under arrest for treason against the Empire." The students froze. Gall felt his pulse surge. Seldon simply nodded. "Of course," he murmured. "The numbers said it would be today." The guards surrounded him, leading him out into the endless corridors of Trantor. Citizens turned to stare as he passed, an old man among soldiers, calm in the face of destiny. Word spread quickly. In the taverns, in the archives, in the data streams that hummed through the city's veins, people whispered of the man who claimed to predict the end. Some mocked him, others feared him, a few began to believe. As night fell, the great capital glowed like a dying ember against the void. From orbit, it still looked magnificent, a planet wrapped in light, pulsing with the illusion of eternity. But deep within, something fundamental had shifted. The trial of Hari Seldon had begun, and with it, so had the end of the Empire. They called Trantor eternal, a single planet, yet 1,000,000 cities layered over one another until even its oceans had been hidden under steel. From orbit, it gleamed like a living machine, perfect, ordered, and unstoppable. At its heart stood the Imperial Palace, a mountain of alloy and gold that swallowed entire skylines. Every corridor pulsed with power. Every hallway was watched by invisible eyes. To the rest of the galaxy, Trantor was the center of all things,
the capital of a realm stretching across millions of worlds. The Empire's data lines, trade routes, and thought itself flowed here like rivers to the sea. Senators arrived from distant systems to bow before the Emperor, their ships docking in orbital platforms that never slept. But perfection breeds blindness. And beneath the light of 1,000 towers, cracks were forming. It began quietly. Budgets delayed, reports edited, a colony shipment missing half its supplies, but stamped, approved anyway. On Trantor, these were details, swallowed by bureaucracy that stretched deeper than any gravity well. But to the outlying worlds, it was the start of famine, rebellion, and doubt. Still, no one questioned the illusion. Trantor's sky, hidden under metal plates, was forever lit. Even night was forbidden here. Time itself had been bent into efficiency. And as long as the city hummed, people believed the Empire would too. Every empire has its mythology. Rome had its Caesars. Britain had its empire on which the sun never set. The Galactic Empire had Trantor, proof that civilization could master entropy itself. But what if that belief was the real disease? Hari Seldon thought so. Long before the fall, he had walked these streets, past the towers of statistics, through corridors where decisions for 1,000 worlds were made with the stroke of a stylus. He saw that for all its intelligence, Trantor had become deaf. The Empire's algorithms measured everything except decay. And so, Seldon turned mathematics into prophecy. He called it psychohistory, a science that could predict the movement of civilizations the way physicists predict the motion of planets. He ran the numbers and found the same result each time. The Empire would fall. Not in centuries, but within 300 years. He tried to warn them. He presented equations that mapped doom like constellations. But the Empire didn't believe in decline. It believed in itself. The mathematician was silenced, dismissed, then exiled to the edge of the galaxy with his followers. Trantor kept shining, and yet deep inside its circuits, something ancient stirred. The same truth that haunted Babylon, Rome, and every empire since. Greatness carries the seed of its own end. Every day, the Ministry of Communications processed more data than any human could imagine. Yet none of it mattered. Truth drowned in its own abundance. Senators debated policies that affected entire star clusters without knowing what those worlds looked like anymore. The Empire's rulers were surrounded by perfect information and absolute ignorance. This was the golden lie. From the surface, Trantor looked immortal. Beneath, the rot had a schedule. Some historians later called it the era of satisfied power. Others, the age of blind administration. On the official calendars, it was simply the 12,068th year of the imperial peace. But on a forgotten moon in the periphery, a mining colony rebelled and no one noticed. A governor declared independence, and his report was buried under budget notes. A scientist predicted collapse, and his name was erased from the archives. Trantor didn't fall in a day. It fell in paperwork, in protocol, in 1,000 small denials whispered by people who meant well. This is how empires die, not with explosions, but with silence. The great irony? Even the bureaucrats who kept the machine running felt the weight of something ending. They spoke of slower deliveries, missing funds, the emptiness in the emperor's proclamations. But who wants to be the first to say the gods are gone? So they didn't. They kept writing, filing, approving, smiling, because hope, in its most dangerous form, is habit. Hari Seldon's exile marked the beginning of history's countdown. While the Empire called him a traitor, he began the plan, the most audacious rescue mission in human history. But Trantor was still dreaming. Its people walked under domes of artificial sky, sipping imported wine from worlds they'd never visit, laughing at the idea that the galaxy could change. Yet, outside their steel horizon, rebellion had already begun to breathe. And when the first crack appeared, when a shipment failed, when a satellite went silent, no one believed it was the beginning, because collapse never looks like collapse from the inside. The empire still had legions, fleets, and fear, but its gravity, the thing that kept billions loyal, was gone. All that remained was momentum, and momentum can only carry you downhill. One scholar, centuries later, would describe it like this: Trantor was not destroyed. It merely continued until continuing became impossible. In the holographic archives of the Foundation, those words appear before the footage of the fall. A planet burning not from war, but from exhaustion. And all of it began here, in the Golden Lie. But what happens when the lie breaks? When the machine that rules a galaxy forgets why it was built at all? That's when the countdown reaches zero. There's a strange calm that settles over dying empires. It's the calm of routine, the comfort of systems so vast that they seem immune to consequence. On Trantor, that calm had become culture. You could feel it in the corridors, the hum of air recyclers, the steady pulse of elevators that ran thousands of levels deep. Bureaucrats still came to work. Administrators still filed their reports. Every department still functioned, just a little slower, just a little emptier. The people of Trantor didn't see collapse. They saw inconvenience. To them, decay wasn't disaster. It was simply inefficiency, something for another committee to handle. And yet, beneath the calm, anxiety had become the Empire's unspoken language. The great irony of civilization is that progress can make people allergic to change. Once life becomes comfortable enough, even survival starts to feel like an interruption. Psychologists call it the stability trap. The ancient Romans called it fatigue of greatness. Hari Seldon called it mathematics. His equations showed that the Empire's citizens were no longer driven by purpose, but by preservation. Every decision made in fear of losing what they already had only hastened their loss. History doesn't just repeat, it rationalizes. Trantor's citizens had all the evidence they needed to see decline, yet they explained it away with elegance. They told themselves the frontier rebellions were minor, that new technologies would fix everything, that the Emperor's silence was strategy. The more obvious the truth became, the more elaborate the justifications grew. It's the same pattern across millennia. The Romans built walls instead of reforming. The Byzantines debated theology while enemies stood at their gates. The British Empire disguised withdrawal as diplomacy. And in our time, on a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable star, we repeat the ritual under new names: markets, elections, metrics, likes. Different empires, same denial. The core illusion is always control. People believed Trantor could never fall because its systems were too complex, too interconnected to fail. But complexity is not strength, it's fragility wearing a crown. When Hari Seldon faced the Commission of Public Safety, his words were clinical, almost emotionless. He told them the Empire's collapse wasn't a prediction, it was a diagnosis. "Your disease," he said, "is confidence." The chamber laughed, but no one ever forgets a prophecy that sounds like an insult, so they exiled him. Not because they thought he was wrong, but because they couldn't afford to imagine he might be right. That's the psychology of denial. The mind protects itself by destroying its own warnings. Trantor became a world addicted to reassurance. Each day, citizens consumed propaganda that confirmed their faith in the Empire's endurance. Every broadcast repeated the same message: stability, order, strength. But underneath, a quiet hysteria grew. Because deep down, they knew stability doesn't need to be advertised. You could see it in the architecture. In the early days, Trantor's towers reached upward in confidence, built of open glass and white steel. But toward the end, construction turned defensive. Walls grew thicker, windows smaller, entrances fewer. The city's design began to mirror its fear. It's always the same pattern. As the world decays, its symbols of power become fortresses instead of beacons. There's a line in the Encyclopedia Galactica that captures this perfectly. When the Empire stopped expanding outward, it began collapsing inward. It mistook containment for peace. Modern historians like to debate whether the empire's fall was inevitable or self-inflicted. The truth is that it was both. Entropy is inevitable, but arrogance is a choice. And so the empire chose silence. Even the emperor, Cleon XII, lived inside a palace so isolated that his own courtiers sometimes went weeks without seeing him. His holographic addresses were pre-recorded, his gestures algorithmically smoothed to appear decisive. He had become more symbol than man. That's what happens when leadership becomes performance. The mask starts running the show. The capital's news agencies continued broadcasting optimism until the very end. Trade routes stable, one headline declared. Days after 3 sectors had seceded. Agricultural surpluses high, another reported, as food riots spread through the lower levels. The empire's most powerful weapon was narrative, and it aimed that weapon at itself. Hari Seldon once wrote that the most dangerous moment in any civilization is the one just before collapse, because that's when confidence peaks. And when belief finally snaps, the fall is instant. The first foundation would later call this moment the crisis of belief, the point when equations stop being numbers and start being prophecy. But the people of Trantor weren't ready to believe in prophecy. They believed in schedules, in reports, in structure. Their reality was defined by paperwork, not panic. The bureaucrat in his 27th level office didn't feel the tremors of empire. He felt the weight of forms waiting for his signature. The senator didn't see the end of civilization, only another speech to deliver. And the worker who maintained the city's ventilation grid didn't think about history. He just wondered if his next paycheck would clear. That's the paradox of scale. The larger a system becomes, the smaller its people feel. And the smaller people feel, the less they believe they matter. Until one day, no one does anything. Not because they're evil or lazy, but because they assume someone else will. By then, the empire was ruled by ghosts. Ministries kept passing orders, armies kept marching, and yet purpose had evaporated. When Seldon's followers whispered about the coming fall, they weren't talking about war or rebellion. They were talking about psychology, the moment when belief collapses faster than infrastructure. And if this all sounds familiar, it should. Every generation thinks it's different, that their empire, their systems, their technology will protect them from history's gravity. But human psychology hasn't changed in 12,000 years. Today, we build digital towers instead of metal ones. We measure influence instead of territory. We wage wars through information instead of fleets. And yet, the equations still apply. When comfort becomes identity, decline becomes invisible. In the archives of the Foundation, one of Seldon's apprentices left a final note about the empire's end. They built so many walls that they forgot why they feared the outside. That's what denial looks like, safety that becomes prison. The golden lights of Trantor still burned every night, but they were burning through the last of the empire's faith. Each flicker of light was a calculation, a machine, a cost, and sooner or later every system runs out of power. And when it did, the silence would be total. But before that silence came something even more dangerous, the illusion of one last miracle. A single event that would make everyone believe, for just a little longer, that the empire was still eternal. Because hope, when twisted by fear, can destroy as much as despair ever could. In the lower sectors of Trantor, the night never truly came. The city's endless glow was so constant that the idea of stars had become myth. But sometimes, when the power grids faltered for a few moments, the lights would flicker. And in that darkness, the people remembered what the sky once looked like. A clerk named Laron was working during one such outage. His terminal blinked off, and for the first time in his 30 years of service, the silence of the city pressed against him. He waited, expecting the system to reboot. It didn't. The hum of the ventilation fans slowed, and somewhere in the distance, metal groaned like a living thing in pain. When the power returned, so did the routine. Laron resumed his work, approving freight transfers between sectors he would never see. But something stayed with him. the thought that if the light could go out once, it could go out again. He didn't speak of it. On Trantor, silence was safer than curiosity. In the upper levels, far above him, the great towers gleamed like frozen suns. The nobles held banquets that lasted through the night, their laughter echoing across glass bridges that spanned entire districts. Music played. Servants glided silently between them like ghosts. At one such gathering, Senator Hari Seldon toasted the emperor's wisdom while secretly drafting letters to her allies about succession. Her words were loyalty. Her eyes were calculation. She was not a villain, just another believer in inevitability. Her own kind of psychohistorian, convinced she could read the tides of power. Meanwhile, in the mechanical underworld beneath the city's surface, the air technicians worked in shifts so long they forgot the concept of days. Among them was a young woman named Tira, whose father had once spoken of the world before Trantor's metal shell, when there were still fields and open air. She didn't believe him until one day, while repairing a collapsed maintenance shaft, she found a patch of soil no one had noticed in centuries. It crumbled in her hand like dust. She kept it, a handful of dead earth, sealed in glass, a secret reminder that there had been something before the Empire. And maybe there would be something after. Across the city, tiny fractures like these were forming everywhere, in the minds of clerks, in the doubts of senators, in the quiet rebellions of workers. None of them thought of themselves as revolutionaries. Yet each small hesitation, each moment of disbelief, was another crack in the armor of faith. Above it all, Hari Seldon watched from exile. The Empire had silenced him, but it could not erase the equations. Through his network of followers, the seeds of the first foundation, he tracked every shift in probability, every tremor in the data. The numbers were converging. One night, Seldon's apprentice, Rach, came to him with the latest projections. "If the trend holds," he said, "Trantor will fall within 3 centuries." Seldon didn't look surprised. He only asked, "And humanity?" Rach hesitated. "If the plan succeeds, 1,000 years of darkness. If it fails, 30,000, Seldon nodded, his face unreadable. "Then we have no choice but to prepare." He turned back to his console. In the dim light, the holographic equations floated like constellations, each line a prophecy written in mathematics. And as he studied them, he whispered, "The future isn't to be predicted. It's to be built." Meanwhile, the imperial palace prepared for a festival celebrating 12,000 years of rule. Fireworks exploded across the sky domes. Citizens cheered. But in the lower sectors, the air systems failed again, only for a few seconds, yet long enough for panic to ripple through the workers who lived in the depths. One of them, a mechanic named Darrell, climbed to a maintenance platform and looked toward the faint glow of the surface. "If the Empire's so strong," he murmured, "why does it sound like it's breaking?" No one answered. The noise of machinery drowned his voice, and the work continued. In the Senate chambers, debates over taxation stretched into absurdity. Senators shouted about planetary loyalty, yet none could name the worlds they represented. Every argument became theater, every decision, delay. When one senator proposed investigating corruption in the transport ministry, the motion was applauded, recorded, and filed away in a subcommittee that would never meet. History would later call it the era of the paper war. And yet, not all who served the Empire were blind. In the military archives, a young officer named Bel Rios began noticing inconsistencies in the reports. Fleets listed as active that no longer existed, garrisons paid for soldiers who had died decades earlier. He tried to raise concerns. His superiors told him to stop thinking like a historian. He didn't. That decision would one day make him a hero and a threat. But for now, he was just another voice lost in the static of decline. Trantor continued to glow. The city had become a monument to denial, running on inertia and ritual. The trains still ran, the towers still shone, the bureaucracy still functioned. But like a star nearing the end of its life, it burned brighter just before collapse. And beyond the city's metal horizon, the frontier worlds had begun to stir. Entire sectors whispered of independence. The Empire's governors demanded more troops, more funds, more reassurance. But the core could only send words, not strength. On one distant world, a rebellion flickered like a spark. It was crushed swiftly, efficiently. The Emperor's broadcast declared victory. The people of Trantor cheered, yet somewhere in the depths of the planet, beneath the rubble, a survivor carved words into the wall. "We will return when the stars forget your name." The inscription wouldn't be found for centuries, but when it was, the Foundation would record it as the first prophecy of the New Age. Back on Trantor, Tira, the air technician, climbed to an observation hatch near the surface. It was forbidden, but curiosity was stronger than fear. She pressed her hand against the reinforced glass and stared at the faint outlines of the sky domes. For a heartbeat, a tiny fissure ran through the transparent surface. A sliver of pure, natural light broke through, real sunlight, unfiltered, untamed. It lasted only a second before the automatic seals engaged. The system corrected itself. The city returned to shadow. But Tira had seen it. She would never forget. She whispered to herself, "The light still exists." And somewhere far above her, Hari Seldon felt the same truth. He looked at his equations, then at the stars beyond Trantor's metal sky, and realized the plan had begun. Because empires do not fall in a day. They fall one forgotten moment at a time, until suddenly they are memory. The flicker of doubt, the hesitation of a clerk, the curiosity of a worker. These were the invisible beginnings of history's greatest revolution, and when the silence finally came, it wouldn't be empty. It would be filled with the echo of those who had already begun to dream of what came after. The future was coming. Quietly. Inevitably. You'll feel the atmosphere of a civilization at its height, and the whisper of a science that dares to quantify destiny itself. In a quiet corner of the Imperial University on Trantor, a man once claimed he could predict the future, not through prophecy, or faith, or chance, but through numbers. His name was Hari Seldon. It began as a thought experiment, a mathematical curiosity. What if, he asked, the behavior of large populations could be predicted statistically, just as molecules in a gas obeyed physical laws, even though no single molecule could be traced? Most scholars dismissed him. After all, how could you possibly calculate something as chaotic as human emotion, as random as war, as unpredictable as ambition? But Seldon persisted. He believed that while individual actions were unknowable, the mass motion of billions could form patterns, patterns that revealed the tides of history itself. At first, the equations were abstract. They described civilizations as curves, societies as variables, decline as a slow decay of coherence. He tested them on data from the Empire's archives, population records, trade routes, political reforms. What emerged frightened him. The numbers all pointed to the same truth. The Galactic Empire, which had stood for 12,000 years, was already dead. It would take centuries to fall, but the fall was inevitable. The mathematics didn't lie. The collapse of central administration, the rise of border rebellions, the exhaustion of resources across millions of worlds. Every dataset converged on the same grim prediction, a dark age lasting 30 millennia. Seldon knew no one would believe him. He barely believed it himself, so he tested the model again and again, feeding it more data, refining variables. Each iteration returned the same trajectory. Civilization was declining not because of invasion or catastrophe, but because of entropy, bureaucratic, cultural, moral. Empires, he realized, die the same way stars do, slowly, beautifully, inevitably. But there was one variable that changed everything. If a small nucleus of scientific knowledge were preserved, hidden, protected, organized, then the collapse could be shortened. The Dark Age could end not after 30,000 years, but after just 1,000. The mathematics didn't merely predict ruin, it whispered of salvation. Seldon called it The plan. Still, the science had no name. Not yet. He coined one himself, psychohistory, the science of mass human behavior. And though it sounded harmless, it was, in truth, the most dangerous discovery in the Empire's history. Because if you could predict the rise and fall of civilizations, you could also manipulate them. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. A few colleagues at the university noticed unusual data requests coming from Seldon's lab, historical archives dating back to the early expansion era, security protocols for interstellar migration, ancient economic simulations. At first, they assumed he was working on a model for imperial logistics, but when they saw the outputs, they understood the scale. Seldon was modeling the Empire itself. One evening, his assistant, Hugo Amaral, confronted him. "You're not just studying history," he said. "You're rewriting it." Seldon smiled, weary. "No, Hugo. I'm only describing what's already written. The universe is made of laws. Human civilization is no exception." "But laws can be broken," Hugo said. "That," Seldon replied, "is what we must prevent." Outside, Trantor shone with the light of 1 billion windows. Air cars hummed across the domes. The Senate held another meaningless debate, and far below the glittering surface, the Empire's archives, vast as continents, recorded everything, every trade deal, every census, every whisper of discontent. Seldon had turned that information into prophecy. The equations became more refined, more confident. He began to simulate centuries into the future. His projections grew darker. Entire sectors would revolt. Trade networks would collapse. Knowledge itself would decay. Humanity would fragment into barbarism. He wrote in his notes, "The fall is unstoppable. Only its duration may be changed." For months, he worked in silence. Sleep became rare, food an afterthought. His eyes reddened from staring at the glowing equations that filled the air of his lab. Students whispered that he had gone mad. One even said he was building a machine that could read minds. They weren't entirely wrong, because psychohistory did read minds, not of individuals, but of civilizations. It read their fears, their habits, their contradictions. It mapped the probabilities of rebellion and reform the way an astronomer charts the motion of planets. But then came the question Seldon couldn't ignore. If the future could be predicted, could it be changed? The answer terrified him, because every attempt to alter the projections without preparation, without creating some controlled structure to preserve knowledge, only made things worse. Like a physician cutting open a patient without understanding the disease, intervention without order led to chaos. Thus, the plan was born out of despair, not hope. He envisioned 2 sanctuaries at opposite ends of the galaxy. Each would preserve knowledge in different ways, one through science and material power, the other through mental discipline and hidden influence, the first foundation and the second. But that would come later. For now, Seldon needed allies, and allies were dangerous. He reached out to mathematicians, historians, and data scientists across Trantor, quietly, discreetly. Those who understood the magnitude of the equations joined him in secret, forming what would become known as the Seldon Project. They met at night in abandoned archive vaults, surrounded by decaying data crystals from forgotten centuries. Each of them had something to lose: positions, reputations, lives. But all of them shared one conviction. If psychohistory was real, it must be used to save humanity. And so they began their great deception. Officially, their mission was simple: to compile a complete record of human knowledge, the Encyclopedia Galactica, a monumental archive to preserve science and history through the coming centuries. The Empire applauded the idea. The project was funded. The scientists were left alone. But that was only the surface. The encyclopedia was a mask. Beneath it, the true plan evolved. The numbers grew more precise. The timelines narrowed. The simulations began to name dates, regions, crises. Each one had a single correct solution, a Seldon crisis, moments when the plan would test itself against chaos. And every projection came closer to the same conclusion. Trantor would fall. The Empire would burn. One night after a particularly harrowing run, Seldon stood before the vast holomap of the galaxy. He watched the simulated flames of collapse spread from the outer rim toward the core. Then he did something no scientist had ever done before. He wept for the future. It wasn't emotion that drove him to continue. It was responsibility. He realized that knowledge, once discovered, could not be unlearned. The equations were now part of reality itself. Once you see the pattern, he told Amaral, you cannot pretend it isn't there. In that moment, Seldon understood the burden of creation. He had invented not a science, but a mirror for civilization, and the reflection was unbearable. Yet even as he despaired, the plan was already in motion. Small teams were leaving Trantor under false names, transporting data, constructing hidden colonies. The Empire didn't notice. Why would it? No one suspects the end while the lights still shine. The Seldon project grew like a heartbeat beneath the city, and in a darkened office at the Ministry of Truth, a junior official stumbled upon a classified data request, anomalies in census projections that didn't match any known department. He hesitated, marked it for review, and filed a report that would take months to process. It was the first time the Empire's bureaucracy brushed against the shadow of the plan. History would later record that moment as the beginning of everything, because while the Empire slept, Hari Seldon had done the impossible. He had taught mathematics to dream of the future, and that dream would soon become the Empire's greatest threat. Hari Seldon never considered himself a prophet. Prophets dealt in certainty. He dealt in probability. In the quiet hours between calculations, he often wondered what kind of arrogance it took to believe one could understand the human mind at scale. He told himself it wasn't arrogance, but necessity. Still, the line between the two grew thinner with each new model. He once said to his students, "If we can chart the decay of stars, should we not chart the decay of empires?" It sounded elegant, almost moral. But beneath the elegance was a question he never answered aloud. If one could foresee the future, did one also have the right to alter it? Psychohistory was built on two pillars, mathematical precision and human blindness. The first allowed prediction. The second made it necessary. If individuals ever learned the results of the equations, they would act differently, altering the very data that made prediction possible. The moment the future was known, it would cease to exist as calculated. So the science depended on secrecy. Seldon compared it to medicine. The patient must not know the details of the treatment, only that it is being administered. But what if the patient is an entire civilization? What if you must deceive billions to save them? He tried to reason through it in his notes. Ethics and mathematics diverge when time becomes a variable, he wrote. To do nothing is cruelty. To act is manipulation. The Empire, he believed, had lost the ability to see itself honestly. Its rulers clung to ceremony, its scholars to hierarchy, its citizens to comfort. The system no longer evolved, it only repeated. Psychohistory became, in his mind, the tool that might reintroduce truth, not through speech, but through structure. He began to think of humanity as a system governed by forces larger than intention, economic drift, demographic pressure, the inertia of power. Even morality, he thought, was statistical. Most people were good enough most of the time. That was what allowed civilization to exist at all. He never spoke of destiny. He spoke of probability fields. But sometimes, alone, he would look at the galactic map and whisper, "We are not gods. We are custodians of momentum." That distinction mattered to him. Hugo Amaral once accused him of coldness. "You talk of civilizations as though they were numbers," he said. Seldon replied quietly, "Because if I think of them as people, I will stop." He meant it. Compassion could paralyze him, so he learned to love humanity abstractly, like a physicist loves the elegance of gravity, not the falling of a single stone. The deeper he explored the theory, the more he saw the pattern. Every empire reached a point where preservation became more important than purpose. When that happened, innovation slowed, curiosity dulled, art turned ornamental. The equations always bent downward from there. He realized psychohistory wasn't just a tool to save civilization, it was also a mirror showing that no civilization truly wished to be saved. Not when comfort still existed. Seldon often imagined the empire as a dying forest. From above, it looked green and alive, but at its roots, rot had already set in. Each new reform decree was like pruning leaves while ignoring the soil. He began lecturing less and writing more. Each essay grew darker, more philosophical. One, titled "The Curve of Inevitable Decline," ended with a single sentence. Entropy is not evil. It is the price of existence. To his colleagues, this sounded like surrender. To Seldon, it was the opposite. If entropy was inevitable, then the moral act was to reduce its pain. He imagined the plan not as salvation, but as anesthesia, a way to make the fall bearable. Sometimes, in the middle of a calculation, he would pause and stare at the projection of the empire's collapse. His students would think he was checking for errors. In truth, he was wondering how many billions of lives his equations might affect. Then he would return to work. Because psychohistory demanded detachment. Emotion was noise. Bias altered probability. And yet, paradoxically, the plan depended on faith, a faith that future generations, guided only by fragments of his design, would make the right choices at the right moments. The equations could not predict individual heroes or villains. They only drew the corridor within which choice could safely occur. This was the heart of psychohistory, freedom inside structure. He tested this idea with smaller models, colonies, city economies, even academic networks. Each time, the results aligned. Systems with boundaries but internal freedom were the most resilient. Total control led to rebellion. Total freedom led to collapse. The balance point became his obsession. How much chaos was necessary for renewal? How much order was needed for survival? He once told Amaral, "A civilization must never be comfortable enough to stop dreaming, nor desperate enough to forget how." That became one of the guiding axioms of the plan. The empire's collapse was not to be stopped. It was to be guided, its pain channeled toward rebirth. The first foundation would preserve science and technology. The second, hidden and secret, would preserve psychohistory itself, ensuring that when the first faltered, guidance would still exist. It was a design built on humility and control, logic and hope. But even Seldon sometimes wondered if it was moral to decide the path of an entire species. In one private entry, never meant for anyone else, he wrote, "The future is a shadow we cast with our choices. The larger the light, the longer the shadow." He began to understand that psychohistory was less a science of prediction than a philosophy of responsibility. It didn't absolve humanity of choice. It amplified the consequences of everyone. Late one night, he stood again before the hollow map, the galaxy glowing like a field of fireflies. "I can see their patterns," he whispered, "but not their hearts." Amaral, half asleep in the corner, asked, "Is that enough?" Seldon didn't answer, because he knew the question wasn't for Amaral, it was for history, and history would answer soon enough. In the high spires of the Imperial University, silence had become dangerous. The walls that once echoed with equations now listened. Every conversation, every careless mention of the plan was another line entered in a hidden report, another whisper passed to the Imperial Commission on Unorthodox Sciences. Hari Seldon had always known this day would come. The math said so. He stood in his office beneath the planet-wide dome of Trantor, looking out over the endless metal horizon. The city was so vast that dawn itself had to be engineered. Every morning, hundreds of thousands of glow panels brightened in sequence, mimicking sunlight through layers of atmosphere that no longer existed. It was a fake sunrise for a fake age of reason. Seldon's eyes flicked to the figures hovering before him, simulations of collapse curves, probability spirals, and decay trajectories. Each one told the same story. The empire would fall, not in 1,000 years, not in 10,000, but in 5 centuries. The math didn't lie, but people did. And in Trantor, lies were survival. He remembered the first time he'd presented the idea to the Council of Mathematicians. They had applauded the brilliance of his equations, the elegance of his reasoning. Only later did the Emperor's aides appear at his door, smiling too politely, asking too many questions about whether such predictions could ever influence policy. It was the beginning of the end. Soon, Seldon noticed his students were being reassigned to administrative service. His assistant's home was searched under the pretext of tax irregularities, and one morning, when he arrived at his office, his access to the data vault was revoked, no reason given. The bureaucratic machine didn't need to accuse you, it could simply erase you. But there was one thing they couldn't erase. The numbers were already out. His students, his followers, had copied his data, distributed it through informal networks of archivists and librarians. Psychohistory had become an underground scripture. Still, the Imperial Security Service worked faster than his equations had predicted. They traced a leaked copy of his calculations to a data broker on Mycogen's sector. The man was arrested. 2 days later, his body was found in the lower heat ducts, officially a tragic maintenance accident. Seldon's heart broke, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Once knowledge is born, he told his inner circle, it cannot be unlearned. It can only be hidden. He moved his meetings into the old transit levels, centuries-old tunnels beneath Trantor's foundations, where the Empire's original planners had left their forgotten schematics. There, among rusted pylons and dim power conduits, the greatest minds of the age met in secret. Historians, statisticians, sociologists, and even a few daring bureaucrats disillusioned by the Empire's stagnation. They called themselves the Encyclopedia Group, a harmless front name to anyone listening. To them, Seldon whispered a prophecy dressed in mathematics. The Dark Age is inevitable. But we can shorten it. We can make the chaos last 1,000 years instead of 30,000. Every meeting ended with the same question from his student, Gall Dornick. But what if they find out? Seldon always answered softly, then we let them believe they've won. The day came when the Emperor did find out. A report landed on the Imperial desk, describing a mathematical cult predicting the fall of the Empire. The First Minister demanded immediate arrests. But Emperor Cleon, more curious than cruel, summoned Seldon himself. The meeting was not a trial. It was theater. Inside the marble chamber, beneath frescoes of past emperors, Seldon stood alone while 1,000 courtiers watched. Cleon was seated high above. His voice filtered through ceremonial amplifiers that made every syllable sound divine. "Professor Seldon," he said, "you claim to predict the future. Tell me, how long until my empire falls?" The hall went silent. Seldon looked up and answered without hesitation. 5 centuries. The whisper that followed that word was like the sound of an ocean turning over. The Emperor's expression didn't change, but the courtiers flinched as though time itself had cracked underfoot. Cleon leaned forward. "Then, Professor, I suppose I should thank you for warning us. We'll take steps to ensure your prediction never comes true." "Your Majesty," Seldon replied, "that's exactly what every emperor in history has said." The next morning, the arrest order came. He was taken under protective custody, though everyone knew what that meant. His research seized, his students interrogated, his name marked for deletion from the Imperial archives. Trantor's media called him a fraud, a doomsayer, a man driven mad by numbers. But the plan had already adapted. His team leaked false data, simplified, harmless equations, while smuggling the real psychohistorical core out of Trantor. Their courier was disguised as a university supply technician. His cargo, a storage crystal labeled hydrostatic models of atmospheric efficiency. Inside it lay the entire predictive foundation of civilization. Even under arrest, Seldon smiled. He told his interrogators exactly what they wanted to hear. that he had renounced the theory, that his work was flawed. The Empire believed him. They always believed the confession more than the truth. Weeks later, at his secret trial, Seldon proposed a compromise: exile. "Send us to the edge of the galaxy," he said, "where we can build an encyclopedia of all human knowledge. A monument to your greatness. Let history remember your empire forever." It was genius, disguised as surrender. The emperor, flattered, agreed. The plan would survive, hidden behind the harmless facade of a scholarship. As the transport ships prepared to leave Trantor, Gaul asked him one last question. "Was this all part of your calculations?" Seldon turned to her, the faintest sadness in his smile. "No, this part was faith." The ships lifted from the surface, their engines lighting the endless metal plain. From orbit, Trantor looked whole again, gleaming, eternal. But within its heart, a silence was spreading, the silence that follows a great betrayal. The Empire had buried the man who could save it, and in doing so, it had sealed its fate. The transport ships left the glittering domes of Trantor behind, carrying with them the seeds of the future. Millions of light years stretched before them, an empty corridor of stars and silence, as the first exiles prepared to land on a world chosen not for beauty, but for obscurity, Terminus. The planet was small, barren, almost comically inhospitable. Its surface, a patchwork of rolling plains and jagged mountains, lacked the rivers, oceans, and forests that civilizations normally depended upon. No great cities predated their arrival, no ancient temples to lend a sense of history. For the casual observer, it was a world of dust and rock. But for Seldon and his followers, it was a blank canvas, a laboratory for civilization itself. Here, the first foundation would take root, not as an empire, not as a power to dominate, but as a repository of knowledge. The encyclopedists, as they called themselves, were tasked with one mission: preserve the sum of human learning, from science and mathematics to art, history, and philosophy. The imperial observers might have dismissed their work as scholastic busywork. In truth, every equation, every manuscript, every crystal of data was a thread in the web of the plan. The landing on Terminus was ceremonial only in the most technical sense. The settlers disembarked with equipment, storage devices, and archives, but also with a heavy understanding of their isolation. Communication with Trantor would be slow, unreliable, and soon to be impossible. The outpost was designed to be self-sufficient, both in resources and governance, yet its greatest burden was the weight of inevitability. They were not simply colonists. They were custodians of a timeline that demanded perfection. As the first cities were sketched onto the barren plains, the galaxy continued to move. The core worlds, decadent and bloated, remained oblivious to the plan unfolding at the fringe. Luxury ships plied the same routes. Bureaucrats debated budgets that no one remembered, and the Emperor's Council debated legislation that would never be enforced. The collapse had begun, but in the core it remained invisible, like the initial cracks in an ancient statue, unnoticed until the weight of centuries caused it to crumble. Beyond the core, the peripheries seethed with unrest. Small systems, neglected by imperial attention, began asserting their autonomy. Trade routes fractured. Pirates, mercenary fleets, and ambitious governors challenged one another for supremacy. Seldon's models had predicted these exact scenarios. The turbulence of the margins would precede the collapse of the center, and in this turbulence, the foundation would find its first opportunities. The encyclopedists, confined by necessity to academic pursuits, were initially powerless in conventional terms. They could not raise armies, claim territories, or enforce decrees. Their power lay in knowledge, an intangible, insidious influence that would grow slowly but inexorably. By studying chemical engineering, physics, and astronomy, they gained practical leverage. Their experiments with energy sources and manufacturing could make them indispensable to local systems. Their trade, initially a means of survival, would become a subtle instrument of political authority. History, as Seldon had observed, moved in cycles.
Empires rose when knowledge, organization, and resources aligned. They fell when hubris, neglect, and corruption outweighed innovation. The first foundation was designed to ride these cycles with unprecedented foresight. Unlike previous civilizations, it would not fall victim to its own pride. Its leaders would be tested, often forced to confront crises designed by the plan itself. But each Seldon crisis was an opportunity to grow, to learn, to extend the influence of the Foundation across the stars. The first century of Terminus was slow. Cities rose in geometric grids, laboratories hummed with electricity, and libraries stretched across plains that had never known walls. Engineers adapted to local conditions. Farmers experimented with soil treatment, creating artificial rivers and irrigation systems. Even in isolation, the settlers discovered the old truth. Civilization is not built from comfort, but from necessity and ingenuity. Meanwhile, the galaxy beyond was fracturing. Some border worlds rebelled openly against imperial governors. Others collapsed silently under administrative neglect. The movement of merchant fleets became unpredictable. Communications between sectors grew intermittent. The core maintained an illusion of stability, but its institutions were hollow. In every model Seldon had devised, the peripheries would erupt before the collapse reached Trantor, and when they did, the first foundation would be ready. The encyclopedists understood that they were not simply preserving knowledge, they were becoming history's architects. By documenting technology, mathematics, and medicine, they created leverage in an otherwise anarchic universe. When a neighboring system required a chemical compound, the Foundation could provide it. When a distant world needed engineers, they dispatched them. Each act of assistance subtly expanded their influence, even as the galaxy continued its descent into disorder. Seldon's plan was meticulous, yet invisible. While empires built walls and fleets, the Foundation built understanding. It traded insight for loyalty, education for autonomy, and science for stability. Its power was not measured in fleets or armies, but in the inevitable dependence of the outer worlds on its accumulated knowledge. As decades passed, rumors of the Foundation spread. Neighboring systems began to recognize its value. Even without the use of force, Terminus became a hub of commerce, innovation, and negotiation. Traders carried more than goods. They carried information, a subtle yet decisive weapon in the war that would come. It was the first proof that Seldon's calculations were correct. Civilization, guided carefully, could bend without breaking. Knowledge was the true currency, stronger than any coin, more enduring than fleets, more persuasive than emperors. The first foundation, seemingly insignificant on the galactic map, was quietly asserting its dominion, not through conquest, but through inevitability. And yet, despite this early success, the shadows of the Empire loomed. Spies and agents still watched the colony from afar, curious and cautious. The core would not surrender its authority willingly. Every shipment, every communication, every decision was observed. A single misstep could draw imperial attention and undo decades of careful work. But the Foundation had one advantage the Empire lacked: foresight. Each choice, each trade, each act of diplomacy was informed by psychohistory. Every Seldon crisis anticipated was a moment of leverage, a chance to extend influence without open confrontation. Civilization's survival, once uncertain, now rested on calculation, subtlety, and patience. And so, from the barren plains of Terminus, the first foundation rose, not with armies, nor with pomp, nor with the roar of battle, but with the quiet, unrelenting power of knowledge made practical. In the shadows of the dying empire, the seeds of a new civilization began to sprout. The galaxy did not notice. Not yet. The wind on Terminus was unlike any Seldon had ever felt on Trantor. It carried not the scent of smog and metal, not the cloying sweetness of a million heated domes, but the raw tang of stone and dust. Each gust seemed to whisper secrets of a planet unshaped by civilization,
a blank slate waiting for human ingenuity. When the settlers first stepped onto the plains, they inhaled a world stripped of artifice, and it unsettled them. Survival here demanded attention, demanded creativity, demanded patience. Buildings rose slowly, forged from local stone and imported metals, their angles precise, their grids measured to anticipate expansion. Water was harvested from deep aquifers, then purified, then rationed. Every step, every pipe, every beam became a testament to human persistence. Unlike Trantor, where convenience masked decay, Terminus rewarded vigilance. A single failure could undo years of work. Inside the laboratories, the hum of generators became a constant pulse, a reminder that life on this edge of the galaxy depended entirely on ingenuity. Beakers clinked, furnaces roared, and microchips were soldered in dim light as engineers worked long into the cold nights. They measured, they calculated, they experimented, and slowly, subtly, they transformed the barren land into a lattice of civilization. Seldon often walked among them, observing, guiding, occasionally pausing to touch a panel, adjust a formula, or speak softly to a young scholar. Theirs was a civilization being constructed not from conquest or ideology, but from thought itself. Each experiment, each new method of extracting energy from the sun or building sustainable structures, carried a deeper purpose: to preserve humanity's cumulative knowledge while the galaxy beyond descended into chaos. And yet, for all the progress, there was a pervasive sense of fragility. At night, the stars stretched across the sky in a cold brilliance, and it was impossible not to feel the weight of isolation. Here, at the rim, the Empire's decay was abstract, distant. The core's decadence did not touch them directly, yet its shadow reached every corner of the galaxy. Trade could vanish in a week, pirates could seize a fleet, communications could falter. The inhabitants of Terminus lived in a constant balance between possibility and vulnerability. Seldon often reminded them that this balance was deliberate. Civilization is most resilient when freedom and structure coexist, when crises are anticipated, and when every choice matters. Entropy is inevitable, he would say, but the consequences are ours to manage. It was a lesson repeated in labs, classrooms, and the council chambers where decisions were debated late into the night. The philosophical weight of the plan, he knew, would be incomprehensible to most outside the Foundation. How could ordinary humans grasp the implications of a multi-millennial strategy designed to shorten a dark age from 30,000 years to 1,000? Yet it was not understanding that mattered, only participation. The human network, guided by psychohistory, needed faith to function. Faith in unseen structures, in future crises, in decisions yet to be made. There were moments when Seldon would pause and observe the young engineers building water turbines or the librarians cataloging centuries of knowledge. Their fingers traced lines of text, their eyes scanned formulas, and the faintest smile would cross his face. They were unaware of the magnitude of their work, yet they carried it faithfully. Their diligence, their curiosity, their stubborn adherence to logic was the quiet engine of the plan. And in the quietest hours, he allowed himself to imagine a world beyond Terminus. He thought of the core, decadent and unheeding, and he thought of the periphery, fractured and chaotic. In his mind's eye, the galaxy was a vast, intricate machine of people, culture, economies, and empires. Psychohistory was the lens through which he could see the gears turning, the inevitable friction points, the stress fractures forming long before anyone else noticed. Seldon understood that the first foundation was not building an empire in the traditional sense. It was creating leverage. By preserving knowledge and making it indispensable, the foundation gained influence without force. When a neighboring system required expertise or technology, the foundation could offer it, gradually weaving a network of dependence. This strategy mirrored ancient human history. The merchants of Venice, the scholars of Baghdad, the engineers of Renaissance Florence. In every era, knowledge had been power. Here, It was survival. He also knew the limitations. No human system is perfect. The plan could anticipate patterns, but not miracles. Anomalies, those unpredictable disruptions of human behavior, could always emerge. This was the nature of the universe: chaos nested within order, freedom existing inside structure. It was why the second foundation would eventually be necessary: to adjust for deviations, to steer the course when chance threatened to derail it. For all its elegance, the plan required patience, restraint, and a deep understanding of human nature. Every trade negotiation, every technological exchange, every scholarly debate was a ripple that could echo across the galaxy in ways no one yet understood. And each time the settlers of Terminus acted wisely, the plan advanced. Each mistake was a lesson encoded for the future, an adjustment in the hidden algorithm that guided civilization's recovery. Seldon sometimes compared it to tending a fire. The flame represented knowledge, civilization, and continuity. Too little fuel, and the fire would die. Too much, and it would consume everything around it. The settlers of Terminus were both caretakers and sparks themselves. Their efforts, though humble, carried the weight of the galaxy's potential future. And yet, despite the enormity of the mission, Seldon never allowed despair to creep in. He reminded his followers daily: survival was possible, not through force or conquest, but through intelligence, adaptability, and cooperation. The outer worlds could flourish not by emulating the core, but by building structures that were resilient to the failures they would inevitably face. Sometimes he allowed himself a quiet thought about our world today. The parallels were undeniable. Nations rise and fall, economies boom and collapse, societies stumble into crises they fail to foresee. Knowledge is power, but only if it is preserved, shared, and applied wisely. He imagined a civilization on Earth, guided by unseen forces, shaped by patterns humans barely perceived. Echoes of his plan writ small in human history. And in that vision he felt a faint reassurance. The galaxy would move as it must. The first foundation was small, fragile, and unseen, but it had begun its work. Civilization, long thought inevitable in its decline, had a chance to endure, if only those entrusted with its preservation remained vigilant. In the libraries, the labs, the council chambers of Terminus, life hummed quietly. The wind still swept across barren plains, the stars still shone cold above, and beneath it all, the plan advanced, patient, invisible, relentless. The first trader to arrive from the neighboring star system was a man named Prem Palver, a merchant with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. He had heard rumors of a settlement that claimed to preserve knowledge, an encyclopedist's colony, the whispers called it, and curiosity had driven him to the edge of the galaxy. Terminus greeted him not with a palace or a port, but with orderly grids of streets, domed laboratories, and stacks of metallic crates whose contents were unknown. Palver was a skeptic by nature, a survivor of countless border conflicts, yet the signs of meticulous preparation struck him immediately. Water purifiers hummed, fields grew with unnatural efficiency, and scholars moved with the kind of focus that only comes from knowing one's purpose is absolute. He knew the core would never have bothered to establish such a settlement. This was not bureaucratic efficiency, but intentional design. Over weeks, he became the first unofficial liaison between the Foundation and the wider galaxy. He traded foodstuffs, spare parts, and information, but he quickly realized the Foundation's true currency was far subtler: knowledge. In every exchange, he felt the invisible pull of influence. A single calculation, a formula, a technological insight could shift the balance of an entire star system. It was not coercion, it was inevitability. Meanwhile, within the walls of Terminus, the young engineers and scholars faced their first crises. A shipment of rare metals meant for experimental generators had been delayed indefinitely. Without them, several ongoing projects risked collapse. Panic began to spread among the apprentices, the human vulnerability that Seldon had always warned about. But the senior encyclopedists remained calm, consulting archives, reviewing historical contingencies, recalculating alternatives. Every challenge became a lesson. Improvisation was as important as preservation. Among the settlers, a young clerk named Beta Durrell kept meticulous records of arrivals and departures, not knowing that her work would one day form the backbone of a Seldon crisis solution. Each name she wrote, each schedule she tracked seemed insignificant at the time, but these small acts of order would ripple across decades. She learned the truth of Seldon's philosophy. Civilization is sustained not by grand gestures alone, but by the patience and diligence of ordinary people. Tension mounted as political forces beyond Terminus began to stir. Reports arrived of a neighboring governor seizing trade routes and questioning the legality of the Foundation's presence. Without military power, the colony had to negotiate carefully. Here, the trader's subtle diplomacy became essential. Knowledge itself was the weapon. A precise understanding of metallurgy, chemical processes, and engineering could persuade others to compliance more reliably than fleets or soldiers. It was in these tense moments that the settlers began to understand the true fragility of their situation. A single miscalculation could invite imperial scrutiny, draw the wrong attention, or spark rebellion among neighboring systems. Yet even as fear took root, so did resolve. They were not simply scholars or engineers, they were the guardians of a civilization's future. Every choice carried weight, every misstep was instructive, every victory a foothold in the uncertain landscape of galactic politics. One evening, as the twin moons of Terminus rose over the horizon, casting long shadows across the plains, a message arrived from a distant sector. Its contents were cryptic, but the implications were immediate. A fleet of unknown ships was approaching the outer perimeter. The Foundation's council gathered in urgent assembly. Every simulation, every probability curve, every contingency plan flashed through the minds of Seldon's disciples. In the dim light of the council chamber, the youngest among them whispered, "What if the Empire finds us?" The senior encyclopedist's reply was measured, yet carried a chill that cut through the room. "They will not find us yet, but if they do, everything we've built could be undone in a heartbeat." That night, the first real test of the Foundation's fragile authority began. Traders moved quickly to secure key assets, engineers prepared contingency defenses, and scholars calculated the smallest adjustments that might protect the colony. Outside, the winds of Terminus carried a biting reminder of their isolation. Civilization was no longer theoretical. It was a living, breathing experiment, and the universe was about to intervene. In the shadows of the laboratories and council halls, Seldon's voice, preserved in recordings for training, echoed through the settlement. Each crisis will test not only your intellect, but your humanity. Do not be afraid to fail. Learn, adapt, survive. And remember, the plan is not static. It is alive, like you. As the first distant lights of the approaching fleet shimmered on the horizon, the settlers realized they were not merely waiting. They were participating in the unfolding of history itself. And in that moment, the full weight of Seldon's vision became clear. The plan had begun, but its true challenges were only just emerging. The galaxy beyond Terminus was a storm of uncertainty, a turbulent frontier where small systems carved fleeting empires from chaos. In this vast and fractured space, the first Foundation began its transformation from a scholarly settlement into a force that no star system could ignore. It was not an army that expanded, nor a fleet that projected power, but the deliberate, patient spread of knowledge, commerce, and influence, a quiet inevitability. Cities grew along the carefully planned grids of Terminus, each new laboratory, archive, and university building marking another step toward resilience. Scholars cataloged chemical formulas, mathematical principles, astronomical observations, and technological innovations, creating a web of expertise that could be leveraged across the galaxy. Knowledge became currency, and Terminus became a bank of solutions for any crisis that might afflict the Outer Rim. The expansion was not uniform. Some nearby systems welcomed the Foundation, recognizing its value and pledging allegiance in return for expertise and technology. Others resisted, seeing in Terminus a subtle threat, a competitor in trade, a hidden power without armies. The Foundation's leaders, guided by psychohistory, understood that conflict was inevitable but predictable. Each diplomatic engagement, each calculated concession, became a ripple in the larger flow of the plan. Trade routes were established, and with them came the first real signs of influence. Traders, now called the merchant princes, carried more than goods. They carried ideas, techniques, and innovations that bound distant worlds into a network of dependence on Terminus. Energy generation methods, water purification systems, navigational charts, even agricultural techniques were exchanged carefully, with each transaction reinforcing the Foundation's subtle dominance. Civilization, it seemed, could advance without overt conquest, driven instead by necessity and intellect. Yet the galaxy remained volatile. Border systems, long neglected by the Empire, were fertile ground for rebellion, piracy, and opportunism. Local governors challenged each other for supremacy, and trade convoys were sometimes ambushed or rerouted. The first Foundation, though powerful in knowledge, was vulnerable in force. Each crisis required a blend of strategic patience and immediate improvisation, a delicate dance that Seldon had anticipated. Meanwhile, the core remained oblivious. Trantor's sprawling bureaucracy continued its slow decay, unaware that the Outer Rim was evolving into something the Empire could not easily control. The Emperor's court debated policies irrelevant to survival, imperial fleets patrolled routes no longer vital, and decrees were passed into a vacuum of compliance. The contrast could not have been starker. While the center floundered in stagnation, the periphery grew in quiet strength, guided by the subtle mathematics of psychohistory. Seldon's predictions were proving true. Each Seldon crisis, a moment when the Foundation faced a choice with only one viable path, was carefully designed to test the adaptability of the colonists and to extend the reach of the plan. The first crises came in the form of external pressures, disputes between neighboring systems, shortages of critical resources, and diplomatic challenges that could escalate into war if mismanaged. Each event, though small in the grand timeline of the galaxy, had consequences magnified through networks of trade, knowledge, and human behavior. The leadership of Terminus adapted swiftly. Mayors and councilors guided policy with careful attention to Seldon's principles. Engineers innovated to meet shortages, and traders turned scarcity into leverage. The Foundation's power was less visible than that of traditional empires, but it was no less decisive. By providing indispensable knowledge and technology, the colonists shaped alliances, controlled economic flows, and ensured that even the most rebellious systems remained within the gravitational pull of Terminus. The human element was crucial. Leaders like Salvor Hardin understood that the plan required not only intellect, but judgment and courage. They acted as intermediaries, negotiators, and sometimes as silent enforcers. Their decisions, measured against Seldon's predictions, often seem miraculous to outsiders, yet each was a calculated step in a trajectory defined long before the first colonists set foot on the barren planet. Simultaneously, the cultural influence of Terminus began to spread. Knowledge was not merely utilitarian, it became symbolic. Libraries and observatories were temples of intellect, workshops of innovation were sanctuaries of problem-solving, and the very act of learning became an instrument of survival. Neighboring systems, initially skeptical, began to revere the Foundation as a hub of civilization in a galaxy teetering on the edge of chaos. Even as influence spread, the threat of the Empire's remnants lingered. Imperial agents occasionally appeared, testing boundaries, gathering intelligence, and probing weaknesses. These incursions served as a reminder that no civilization, however cunning or informed, could escape the watchful eyes of history entirely. Every success of the Foundation was contingent upon vigilance, and every lapse could invite disaster. And yet, despite constant challenges, the momentum of the plan carried the first Foundation forward. Its influence became embedded in the very structure of the Outer Rim. Systems that once had been isolated now depended on Terminus for knowledge, trade, and survival. Civilization's resilience increased not through conquest, but through careful orchestration of resources, human behavior, and the unrelenting advance of understanding. The galaxy in this era was a stage for subtle power. The rise of Terminus proved that empires need not wield swords to dominate. They could command influence through intellect, strategy, and foresight. The plan, invisible yet inexorable, shaped not only events but the minds and choices of countless individuals. And as each new system fell under its quiet sway, the first Foundation inched closer to fulfilling its role in the grand design, a bulwark against the darkness that threatened to engulf the galaxy. The first ripples of disruption appeared, almost imperceptible at first. Rumors of a new power emerging beyond the edge of the known space, hints of technologies that could destabilize trade, whispers of individuals whose choices could not be predicted. Seldon had warned of anomalies, those rare humans whose actions could bend the plan in unexpected ways. And the shadow of the mule, though centuries distant, loomed conceptually as a warning. Even the most meticulous calculations could be challenged by the unpredictable forces of human emotion and genius. From Terminus, the future seemed both fragile and inevitable. Civilization had taken root at the edge of the galaxy, not with the roar of fleets, but with the quiet authority of knowledge applied wisely. Each choice, each trade, each experiment was a step along a path defined by Seldon's vision. The galaxy did not yet recognize it, but the first Foundation was no longer a colony. It was a force of history, subtle yet undeniable, ready to confront the crises that would shape the coming centuries. The streets of Terminus thrummed with quiet energy, a rhythm unnoticed by outsiders but palpable to those who lived there. Dust from the barren plains swirled in every breeze, clinging to the edges of clothing, settling in the corners of domed laboratories and catching the light in tiny motes that glimmered like distant stars. The air was dry, carrying the faint tang of stone and heated metal, a constant reminder that life here demanded attention. Every sound, every odor, every vibration held meaning. A generator humming too loudly could signal a failing system. The clink of metal against metal in a workshop might reveal an innovation or a problem. Inside the libraries, the scent of ink, aged paper, and polished floors created a sanctuary for thought. Scholars moved deliberately among towering shelves, their footsteps soft but purposeful. Each book, each tablet, each carefully coded archive represented centuries of knowledge distilled into a fragile form, yet it was a lifeline to survival. Knowledge here was not abstract, it was tangible, vital, and intensely alive. In the laboratories, experiments emitted subtle symphonies, the hiss of gases, the rhythmic pulse of electrical currents, the low groan of machinery under strain. Engineers worked with meticulous care, aware that a single miscalculation could unravel weeks of progress. Sparks leapt from soldering irons, liquids bubbled in beakers, and the faint glow of plasma arcs illuminated the determined faces of young scientists. The air was thick with anticipation, a tension that was almost tactile. Civilization itself felt alive here, growing, shifting, and demanding constant vigilance. Philosophically, the settlers wrestled with the weight of the plan every day. The Seldon Plan was not merely a set of instructions, it was a framework that demanded foresight, patience, and moral clarity. Could a civilization built on predicted probabilities remain humane? Could a society guided by mathematical inevitabilities still preserve choice, freedom, and individuality? These questions were discussed quietly in council chambers, in study rooms, and in hushed conversations over communal meals. For every victory, there was the shadow of uncertainty. Systems beyond Terminus could fail, neighboring colonies could revolt, trade convoys could be lost. Each day reminded the settlers that civilization was a precarious construct, a delicate balance between order and chaos. Yet this fragility was also the source of resilience. By acknowledging it, by planning for it, the first foundation could adapt in ways that empires of the past, Rome, Byzantium, even the Galactic Empire's core, had never mastered. The parallels to modern times were impossible to ignore. Observers of Earth's global networks would recognize the same tension between knowledge and vulnerability, between innovation and collapse. Economies rise and fall, technologies reshape society, and centralized power often falters under the weight of its own bureaucracy. Terminus, in its careful orchestration of intellect, trade, and diplomacy, mirrored the strategies humanity has always unconsciously employed to survive, and yet it refined them to a degree that felt almost prescient. Even the simple sensory experiences carried philosophical weight. The taste of preserved water, filtered and cooled, reminded the settlers that survival was deliberate. The warmth of sunlight against carefully constructed solar panels was both energy and metaphor. Light as sustenance, knowledge as illumination. And at night, when the twin moons rose above the horizon, the galaxy spread in cold brilliance, stars tracing paths that no human eye could fully comprehend. The universe was vast, indifferent, and yet intimately connected to every choice made within the walls of Terminus. In the council chambers, the hum of conversation mixed with the faint aroma of heated stone and metal. Leaders debated strategies for upcoming crises, considering both mathematical predictions and the unpredictable human factor. The tension between fate and free will was never abstract here. It was concrete, pressing, and immediate. Could a crisis be resolved without violating ethical principles? Could survival coexist with morality? Each decision was a microcosm of the plan itself, a reflection of psychohistory applied in real time. Even daily routines became exercises in philosophical reflection. Apprentices cataloged knowledge, aware that a misfiled volume could ripple into distant consequences centuries later. Traders planned routes and negotiated deals, understanding that every interaction reinforced the Foundation's subtle authority. Engineers repaired machinery, calculated efficiencies, and tested new designs, conscious that a single innovation might shift the balance of power in unpredictable ways. In every action, the plan manifested, quietly shaping civilization while demanding vigilance. The tension of potential anomalies lingered in the background. Though psychohistory predicted large-scale patterns, it could not account for every variable. Unpredictable individuals, those whose choices defied probability, were the shadows in the plan. Their presence was always implied, always anticipated, but never fully visible. The settlers understood that their efforts might be tested by forces beyond their comprehension, and in this understanding, a strange calm emerged. Preparation and awareness were their shields, and knowledge their greatest weapon. Even as trade expanded, new alliances formed, and the First Foundation's influence grew, there remained a persistent reminder of fragility. The core of the empire, distant yet omnipresent, continued its slow decay. Trantor's bureaucracy moved without insight, and the culture of indulgence persisted. If ever the core chose to assert itself, the outer rim would face forces no calculation could fully predict. Every choice, every negotiation, every technological advancement was a step on a razor's edge between survival and catastrophe. In the laboratories, the libraries, and the council chambers of Terminus, the people felt the weight of history pressing against them. Civilization was no longer theoretical. It was alive, demanding, fragile, and potent. And as the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human ambition, one truth became unavoidable. Knowledge alone was not enough. Vigilance, foresight, and adaptability were equally crucial. And yet, the plan advanced, quietly, inexorably, across the silent, endless void. The wind carried a biting chill across Terminus, bending the sparse grasses and rattling the edges of domed laboratories. Inside one such dome, Hober Mallow, a young merchant prince, examined a shipment of intricate machinery just arrived from a distant system. Each device was a marvel, a fusion of engineering and mathematics, designed to improve energy efficiency, crop yields, or navigational systems. Yet Mallow could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on him. Each shipment represented more than goods. It represented influence, allegiance, and survival. Mallow had grown up on Terminus, trained in the subtleties of trade and diplomacy, yet the scale of his duties now surpassed anything he had imagined. He negotiated with governors of neighboring star systems who, outwardly courteous, carried suspicion in every measured smile. Every conversation was a negotiation not just of material resources, but of trust, fear, and potential rebellion. One misstep could destabilize years of careful planning. Meanwhile, Beta Darrell walked through the bustling corridors of the Central Archive, carrying reports from distant observers. Her meticulous record-keeping had earned her respect, yet she often wondered if the tiny decisions she catalogued, the arrival of a single trader, the delay of one shipment, might tip the scales in ways she could not predict. Psychohistory suggested patterns, trends, inevitabilities, but it could not encompass the ripple of a human heart, the unpredictability of courage or folly. A disturbance at the eastern perimeter drew Mallow and Darrell to the observation decks. A fleet of unknown vessels glimmered in the distant starlight, their approach deliberate yet enigmatic. The outer rim systems had long depended on Terminus for technological aid, yet now, for the first time, a direct threat tested the Foundation's subtle authority. Was this a miscalculation, an anomaly, or the first stirrings of a rebellion that could fracture the fragile network? In the council chambers, the senior encyclopedists reviewed simulations, tracing probabilities across dozens of potential outcomes. Each model suggested a different approach: negotiation, delay, or calculated deception. Seldon's voice, preserved in ancient recordings, resonated through the room. Every crisis is a test, not of your knowledge alone, but of your judgment. Yet judgment, as they all knew, could be twisted by fear, ambition, and the unknowable choices of individuals. Outside, in the city streets, ordinary citizens sensed the tension without fully understanding it. Traders hurried to complete transactions before supplies became scarce. Engineers ran diagnostics on generators, checking and double-checking circuits. Children watched the skies for the telltale lights of approaching fleets, their play muted by the weight of uncertainty. Civilization was alive here, each heartbeat intertwined with decisions made across thousands of miles, shaping destinies not yet written. Among the council, Mallow argued for a daring strategy. Rather than retreat or appeal to distant authorities, they would assert influence through the very trade networks that had secured their power. By controlling access to critical technologies, the Foundation could force compliance without firing a single weapon.
The room buzzed with tension, some elders advocating caution, others nodding at the brilliance of the plan. Each opinion, each hesitation, became a thread in the web of survival. Beta Darrell, however, saw another dimension. She noted the psychological weight on the settlers, the fear that even subtle coercion might breed resentment. Could civilization endure if trust was undermined, even for strategic advantage? She pressed for careful diplomacy, for the weaving of influence without crushing autonomy. In her quiet insistence, she reminded the council that the human element, the unpredictable choices of hearts and minds, was the invisible force shaping every outcome. As decisions crystallized, the first signs of disruption arrived.
a fleet detached from the approaching armada, moving with unfamiliar coordination toward a vital trade route. Sensors indicated a new technology, one that could undermine the Foundation's communications and logistics. The Council realized, almost simultaneously, that this was no ordinary challenge. The Seldon plan had accounted for crises, but not for an anomaly of such precision and subtlety. Panic threatened to ripple through the city. Traders hesitated, engineers paused in mid-calculation, and the apprentices stared in disbelief at the simulations showing potential catastrophic outcomes. Yet the leaders maintained calm, knowing that reaction without thought could unravel decades of careful preparation. Each member of the council, each citizen, became a participant in a grand experiment of survival, testing not just intellect, but patience, judgment, and courage. Late into the night, Mallow and Darrell met in the observation deck, watching the approaching lights reflect against the metallic surfaces of the city. Silence stretched between them, charged with anticipation. "If we miscalculate," Darrell whispered, "all of this, gesturing to the domes, the streets, the laboratories, could be gone in a heartbeat." Mallow's response was measured, though the tension was evident in his eyes. "We cannot miscalculate. Every choice, every shipment, every trade, it all matters now. The galaxy is watching, and the plan is testing us in ways no simulation can fully predict." As they spoke, the fleet drew closer, the unknown technology humming faintly against the backdrop of the stars. Citizens of Terminus held their breath, unaware that their lives were now entwined with forces both visible and invisible. The first true anomaly had arrived, a ripple capable of cascading into chaos, forcing the Foundation to confront the fragility and resilience of civilization simultaneously. And in that moment, as lights shimmered across the horizon and alarms began their low, rhythmic warning, the settlers understood the truth Hari Seldon had always warned them of. Even the best-laid plans could be disrupted by forces that no calculation could entirely predict. The first Foundation had grown, had influenced, had survived, but the next step in the plan would demand ingenuity, courage, and the kind of human resolve that no formula could guarantee. The moons of Terminus cast long, cold shadows over the city. The unknown fleet's lights reflected in the domes and glass, promising a confrontation whose consequences might redefine civilization itself. Every trader, engineer, scholar, and clerk felt it. The Seldon plan was no longer theoretical. It was alive, it was testing them, and the galaxy waited with bated breath. The sky above Terminus burned with the pale glow of approaching fleets. The city, once a quiet hub of intellect and trade, had become a stage upon which destiny itself seemed to pause. Citizens, scholars, and leaders alike stood at the windows of domed observation halls, their breaths caught in awe and tension. Civilization had reached a precipice, and the next choices would echo across the galaxy. Mallow's hand rested on a navigational console, fingertips tracing the delicate filigree of mapped star systems. Each pulse of the lights on the display represented an ally, a potential threat, a system whose loyalty was yet untested. The plan had prepared them for crises, but the anomaly before them, a fleet armed with unknown technology, moving with uncanny precision, defied prediction. It was an imperfection in the grand algorithm, a human and technological variable that tested the very limits of psychohistory. Baita Darrell stood beside him, eyes scanning the simulation readouts, mind racing through contingencies. "We've built this city, these networks, these alliances, every step designed for survival," she said, voice low, almost a whisper against the hum of machinery. "But survival is no longer enough. We must act, and the margin for error has narrowed to nothing." The city thrummed with urgency. Scholars recalibrated instruments, engineers rerouted power, and traders coordinated convoys that could be leveraged as strategic lifelines. The sensory tapestry of Terminus, a symphony of metal, glass, and human intent, was alive, responsive, and taut with suspense. It was a civilization at the intersection of intellect and instinct. each pulse of energy and decision a thread in the fragile web of survival. From the council chambers, the voices of leaders rose and fell like currents in an ocean, debating strategy, ethics, and probabilities. Every option carried weight. Every hesitation was magnified by the awareness that the anomaly could unravel decades of planning. Even as the first foundation had grown into a force of knowledge and influence, the threat reminded them of the fragile calculus of power. Civilization was not eternal. It could bend, fracture, or be erased in a single misstep. The anomaly advanced with deliberate intent. Fleets moved with precision that suggested intelligence, coordination, and a vision beyond any ordinary opponent. Sensors recorded energy signatures that defied prior understanding, technologies that hinted at an evolution of thought and design. Terminus faced not merely conflict, but a confrontation with the unpredictable, a test of judgment, ingenuity, and the resilience of human will. In the streets, ordinary citizens sensed the gravity of the moment. Apprentices paused mid-step, clutching tablets and instruments. Traders froze as caravans rolled through the city, engines humming with anxious anticipation. Children pressed against the glass of observation domes, eyes wide at the glimmering lights of approaching ships. Fear and awe mingled in the air, yet so did resolve. This was the crucible in which the destiny of civilization would be forged. Mallow issued orders, each precise, deliberate, and informed by both probability and instinct. He coordinated diversionary trade routes, calculated resource allocation, and activated contingency protocols designed to stabilize vulnerable systems. Beta implemented diplomatic channels, sending emissaries to neighboring colonies, framing strategies that turned potential resistance into cautious cooperation. Every action reinforced the plan, yet every decision carried the weight of uncertainty. As the fleet reached striking distance, a ripple of dissonance passed through the city. Instruments detected anomalies, communications flickered with unexpected interference, and the probability models shifted unpredictably. The anomaly, the unpredictable factor that psychohistory had accounted for only as a shadow, was real, immediate, and challenging every expectation. Terminus stood at the edge of collapse, yet the calm precision of its leaders, forged over decades of preparation, held the city together. In the observation deck, Mallow and Durrell looked out over the lights of the city, the distant glow of the approaching armada, and the stars beyond. "History tests us," Mallow said, voice firm but low. "Not with gentle nudges, but with storms that could sweep away everything we've built." Durrell's gaze lingered on the horizon. "And yet," she replied, "it is precisely in these storms that the plan comes alive." Civilization is not a monument to permanence. It is a living organism, shaped by intellect, courage, and the choices of those who refuse to yield. The first volleys of engagement shimmered across the void, subtle yet decisive. Trade networks became lifelines. Technological ingenuity turned vulnerability into advantage, and diplomacy wove a fragile tapestry of alliances that held the outer rim together. Civilization survived, not through brute force, but through the quiet, relentless application of knowledge and foresight. The first foundation had become both shield and sword, invisible yet undeniable. Yet even as victory emerged, the philosophical weight of the moment pressed down. Seldon's plan, though remarkable in scope and subtlety, was still contingent upon the choices of imperfect humans. Every victory was provisional, every success a reminder that history's currents were vast, indifferent, and often unpredictable. The galaxy had been shaped by intellect, trade, and diplomacy, but it remained, at its core, a theater of uncertainty. And so, as the fleets withdrew and the first tentative signs of stabilization appeared across the outer rim, the citizens of Terminus realized the paradox of their survival. Knowledge had preserved civilization, but it had also revealed the fragility inherent in all empires. The plan had guided them, yet it had not absolved them of responsibility. The weight of choice, of courage, and of human will remained. In the quiet aftermath, the moons of Terminus cast long shadows over the city, reflecting the light of distant stars and the glimmering lights of ships returning to orbit. Observers noted the silence, almost sacred, that followed the storm. It was a moment of reflection, of understanding, and of anticipation. The first foundation had survived the anomaly, yet the universe remained vast, indifferent, and filled with the unknown. The philosophical question lingered, as inescapable as the stars themselves. If civilization can be predicted, influenced, and guided, what of the unpredictable human heart? If the galaxy's fate can be calculated, what of those anomalies who defy probability, who rewrite history with a single decision, who become forces the plan cannot foresee? And beyond Terminus, beyond the outer rim, beyond the very reach of human comprehension, the shadows waited, remnants of the Empire, latent crises, and the faint stirrings of anomalies yet to emerge. Civilization had endured, knowledge had triumphed, and the plan had advanced. But the lesson was clear. Even the most careful designs must bow to the infinite complexity of life and choice. Our world today may follow the same fate. Empires rise and fall. Knowledge preserves, guides, and shapes society. But uncertainty is eternal. Power is fragile. Civilization is contingent upon vigilance, foresight, and the courage to act when the universe itself seems to defy reason. The first foundation endured, yet the question persists for every civilization, on every world. If every empire must fall, can even our own world escape the same fate?